Well, hey everybody, it's Mr. Schauber, and welcome to our presentation on World War II in the Pacific. Uh, this is going to be mainly the United States military against the Japanese military, and it's going to be ferocious. It's going to be just huge in scope, and it's going to be some of the fiercest fighting in all of World War II. So let's look at kind of how this gets going. How does World War II in the Pacific get going? Well, from the American vantage point, it all starts on December 7th, 1941, when Japan attacks the US at Pearl Harbor, and this is going to bring us into the war. Of course, we know the gist of Pearl Harbor is that it's a Sunday morning on December 7th. Most of our sailors and people involved in that were stationed in Hawaii are uh, asleep or getting up for church, or and we get attacked by the Japanese. Our planes are sitting on tarmacs. Our battleships are sitting, uh, um, on in the bay, and we are just sitting ducks, is what we are. And the Japanese take advantage of that, and they fly over and basically just drop bombs on us and just hammer us in, and destroy a lot of our Pacific fleet right then and there. When it's all said and done, about 2,400 Americans are killed. We lose 300 warplanes, and 8 out of our 9 battleships there at Pearl Harbor were sunk, including the USS Arizona, which is probably the most famous of the battleships, just because it's still at the bottom of the harbor. We lost about 1,200 men alone on that battleship that sunk to their death. And of course, they made a memorial. The Pearl Harbor Memorial is just above that USS Arizona battleship, and it still gets tons of visitors every year that go out to see that thing, and it's quite a sight. So that's how the United States gets involved in the war. Now, fortunately for us, the thing that saved our bacon for the time being was that our aircraft carriers were out doing a training mission that morning, and so they weren't sitting in the harbor to be bombed by the Japanese airplanes that flew over. So we didn't lose our battleships, and that allows us to keep going. Uh, Even after the attack, the Japanese thought they might have crippled us and that we might surrender at that point. Well, we still have some aircraft carriers and airplanes to use to fight back, and so that's how the war in the Pacific is going to turn. It's going to become, at first anyway, kind of an aircraft carrier airplane war until we can rebuild more airplanes, more battleships, and until we start landing troops on islands to take back islands the Japanese have captured. Here's a quick map of Pearl Harbor, and you can just kind of see where we had our battleships and our where everything was, right? And man, we took a beating because we weren't suspecting the attack. The men there weren't suspecting it, and they got hit. They got blindsided, and we got nailed. So it's going to be the effect this is going to have. Really, it's going to make America upset. It's going to make Americans really mad. We don't surrender. We don't give up. We just get really ticked off. And so we joined the war at that point, and we don't have any problem getting recruits and people that just want to sign up for the military. There's no problem building a huge army, huge navy, huge Marine Force, Air Force. And back then, the Army and Air Force were combined into one unit. But we have no problem getting enough and to spare, right? Soldiers, sailors, and fighters to fight this war. Now, this map kind of shows you just an overview of. It says it's called Japanese aggression, obviously in World War II, and where they fought some of their major battles. Now, the Japanese had already gone into China, and by the time it's all said and done, before they attacked Pearl Harbor, they'd gone into China and had done major damage there. And after Pearl Harbor, they're going to go all throughout the Pacific. They're trying to build an empire of their own. And so you can see they got pretty far, and the extent of their attacks and conquests was not small by any means. Quickly, here are some of the Japanese uniforms and then some of their weapons. The Japanese were very basic in their uniforms. Japanese are about getting things done, and so they pretty simplistic in their uniforms. Of course, in the Pacific, most of the time it's hot, it's humid. I mean, you're not going to want a lot of warm weather clothing for the Pacific battles, that's for sure. The main Japanese rifle was this one, the ARISAKA Type 38, and you can see the kind of rounds it fired. Japanese soldiers usually also carried a samurai sword, right? And this goes back to ancient Japan, this idea of samurai sword, but this was a side weapon that they would use. And their main type of pistol, the Type 94 NAMBU pistol. Okay, pretty basic in its design, pretty rudimentary, but this was what the Japanese generally carried as a sidearm. Now, the Japanese had some really good airplanes, and the best Japanese naval bomber in the first year of the war that really helps them dominate in the Pacific the first year, throughout 1941 and 42, mainly was the Mitsubishi, and that the G3M, and the Mitsubishi was the maker, right? Of course, they make cars today and things, but they made the airplanes back then. Kawasaki might also be a name you're familiar with. And the Ki-32 was one of Japan's best aircraft, also in the early stages of the war. It was a dive bomber, could hold about 1,000 pounds of bombs. And in Allied code, and I tried to put for some of these airplanes what the Allied code name was, because then the Americans sometimes either didn't want to pronounce the whole, or couldn't pronounce, didn't want to pronounce, whatever it was, and so they just used code names for these Japanese planes. This was known as Mary. And the Mitsubishi A6M Ryzen was known as the Zero. This was the symbol of the Japanese air power. Okay, this was in action from Pearl Harbor to the very end of the war. The Japanese made more Zeros than any other plane, and it really helps Japan at the first part of the war, along with those first two planes we saw, really kind of dominate the Pacific early on. So the Zero is going to be kind of their main plane. This Nakajima Ki-43, a fast fighter plane. It was Japan's best fighter in the early stages of the war. It was used throughout. It was called Oscar by the Allies. The Aichi D3A, first Japanese plane to bomb American targets in World War II. The plane sank more Allied military ships than any other. One of the best known dive bombers of its time. It was known as VAL to the Allies. So very effective. And the Nakajima B5N, the best Japanese carrier-based torpedo plane. 144 of these took part in the attack at Pearl Harbor, and this plane was the one that sunk the American aircraft carriers, the Lexington, the Yorktown, and the Hornet. It was known as Kate to the Allies. And the AICHI E13A, the most important seaplane in the Japanese Navy. Saw action throughout the war, known as Jake to the Allies. This pretty crazy, huh? You could fly, of course, in the air, and then you'd land it on the ocean or on the water. Pretty cool. All right, so what happens after Pearl Harbor? Well, Pearl Harbor was only the first of several Japanese offenses across the Pacific. Okay, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese warplanes based in China hit Clark Field, the main American base in the Philippines. And our American planes sat neatly, parked on runways at Clark Field in the Philippines, and the Japanese just swept over the airfield and bombed the heck out of us. Planes and buildings were blown to pieces. It was almost like a repeat of Pearl Harbor. Although news of Pearl Harbor had reached General Douglas MacArthur, who was the commanding U.S. general in the Pacific during World War II, uh, we hadn't really expected an attack right away on the Philippines. And when it came, about half of our force was destroyed as it sat there on the ground. And so within days, a large Japanese force landed in the Philippines. So MacArthur withdrew most of his troops from the mainland Philippines to the Bataan Peninsula in Manila Bay. And before we get to the Bataan Peninsula, here is then kind of an overview of World War II in the Pacific. And you can just see for the first, 1941, end of 41 into 42, Japanese are really doing some major damage. And then something happens and the tide turns, and we'll get to that. So after the Japanese landed troops in the Philippines, like I said, MacArthur withdraws most of his troops to the Bataan Peninsula. Okay, way down, you can see on the map there, that little peninsula jutting out into the ocean. And there, the Americans set up defenses, hoping that the Navy could evacuate the Army to safety. But for about 4 months, American and Filipino troops held out on the Bataan Peninsula. Okay, finally, in late March, President Roosevelt orders MacArthur to escape to Australia. He says, "MacArthur, I can't afford to have you taken captive and killed, or whatever." So MacArthur didn't want to leave his troops that were still there because he knew they'd be overtaken by the Japanese, but he promised, "I shall return." And so when the Bataan Peninsula's troops surrendered to Japanese forces in early April, about 2,000 soldiers and nurses escaped to the fortified island of Corregidor in Manila Bay, and you can see Corregidor on the map as well. And joining the fort's defenders there, they fought for another month. But finally, running low on ammo and food, over 11,000 Americans and Filipinos surrendered on May 6, 1942. And so as the Bataan Peninsula fell, overall, Bataan and Corregidor fell, some 76,000 Filipinos and Americans became prisoners of war. Japanese soldiers split the prisoners into groups of 500 and 1,000 and marched them some 60 miles to a railroad center. Okay, and you can see there on the map then the red dots. After our troops and the Filipinos are captured, the Japanese split them into groups and forced them on a march up to this railroad, up to the railroad depot. And of course, the troops and the Filipinos were already weakened from weeks without enough food and medicine. At least 10,000 soldiers, or excuse me, 10,000 prisoners total die during the 6 to 12-day march. Many were executed by the Japanese if they couldn't keep up. And so this incident became known as the Bataan Death March. And this was such a horrible incident that after the war, the general blamed for organizing the march was one of 6 Japanese executed for war crimes. This is how bad this was. Over 10,000 Americans and Filipinos die during the Bataan Death March. Well, as Japanese forces then spread across the Pacific, the battered American Navy fought desperately to stop them. In May of 1942, a largely American naval group fought against a superior enemy fleet, Japanese fleet, in the Coral Sea. The Battle of the Coral Sea was the first naval battle carried out entirely by aircraft. Both sides, would launch planes from aircraft carriers and would try to go over and attack the enemy. They would have airplane battles in the air, and then you try to go over and find where the enemy aircraft carrier was and bomb them. The costs of the 5-day battle were huge on both sides. Both sides lost more than half their aircraft. We lost 1 aircraft carrier and 1 was badly damaged. But the Japanese had 1 aircraft carrier sink, another lost most of its planes, and a third was put out of action. So militarily, it was probably kind of almost a tie, if you want to look at it that way. But what is the importance of the Battle of Coral Sea? It prevented Japan from going to Australia and creating bases in Australia and also attacking Australia. So it prevented Japanese, invasion really, and then the creation of bases in Australia. And this was huge. Okay, so, and the Japanese, I think, were shocked that the Americans could still put up such a fierce fight even after Pearl Harbor and after the loss of the Philippines. So we show them here that we're tougher than they think we are. Despite his success at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, head of Japan's Navy in World War II, believed that our naval power was the key, okay, to victory or defeat in Asia, and he had to take out our naval power. And so, of course, he had done some major damage at Pearl Harbor, but he needed to finish us off. And of course, as we built new warships, he realized that Japan would have to defeat us there if they were going to conquer, ultimately conquer in the Pacific. And so there are going to be two major battles, two critical battles that take place in the Pacific at the height of the war in Europe. While Europe, the European campaign is going crazy, there's going to be two major battles in the Pacific between the United States and Japan that really shape the war in the Pacific. And one is going to be this one. The Battle of Midway, the Battle of Midway Island. This is near Hawaii, and this is going to be so important because this was vital to the defense of Hawaii in the long run. Of course, we'd gotten hammered at Pearl Harbor, but we still had Hawaii under our control. The Japanese hadn't invaded and tried to keep troops there. So, as far as that went, so we still controlled the islands. But the Battle of Midway erupts on June 4th in 1942. It is fought entirely from the air, and as just fate would have it, and if you ever want to study about the Battle of Midway, there was some crazy cool things that happened for the Americans, for the benefit of the American side, that the Japanese just couldn't believe it. And one of those things was that our American planes found some of the Japanese aircraft carriers at a vulnerable time. The Japanese were still loading bombs onto their planes when American airplanes flew over and spotted them. And so the Americans swiftly demolished 3 of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers as bombs stacked up on their decks explode, okay, during the attack of our airplanes, from our airplanes. And the 4th Japanese aircraft carrier was destroyed trying to escape. And so the sinking of those Japanese carriers, plus the loss of about 250 planes, Japanese planes, was a devastating blow to the Japanese naval power. And this is going to be the turning point in the Pacific Ocean, because after the Battle of Midway, Japan is unable to launch any more offensive operations. Japan is now forced to go on the defensive and try to hold what they had taken over early on. We're going to now be on offense, trying to take back what the Japanese took from us, and or get the Japanese out of places they had conquered. And so the Battle of Midway allows us to be on offense, and this is, like I said, this is the turning point of the war in the Pacific theater. Then we go to the Battle of Guadalcanal. After Midway, our first goal is to capture this island, this particular island of Guadalcanal, in the larger group called the Solomon Islands. And more than 11,000 Marines, American Marines, land on the island in August of 1942. And this is going to be jungle warfare at its finest, or maybe its worst. When we land 11,000 Marines, Japan has 2,200 men to try to fight us off and protect the island. Well, months of brutal fighting ensue. The Battle of Guadalcanal provides our Marines with their first taste of jungle warfare, and they are slogging through swamps, and they're fording rivers, and they're hacking through tangles of vines, and they would encounter, of course, the Japanese soldiers who were hiding. They were hiding in the underbrush. They were at the tops of palm trees, and they were able to be snipers from those positions. And so they do some major damage to our troops. But when finally, our 11,000 men simply overwhelm their 2,200, and they realize they have to retreat if they're gonna have any men living at the end of this. And so Japan's forces finally slip off the island in February of 1943, and we didn't even know they left the island until Marines discover empty Japanese boats on the beach. But now we have Guadalcanal back. Okay, so we get Midway, we have Guadalcanal, all right, and from Guadalcanal we start what we call island hopping around the Pacific to take back other places the Japanese had, until the ultimate goal, of course, is to get to Japan itself. So, as mentioned, this becomes our strategy in the Pacific: go from one place to another until we can work our way up to Japan. And it's going to be tough, it's going to be brutal, but we're not just going to go straight to Japan right off the bat. We're taking one place at a time, knocking one domino down at a time until we get to the mainland of Japan. All right, so we island hop and go around, and finally we have got close to the Philippines. We're getting back to the Philippines, where Japan has taken over, and Japan has brutalized the Filipino people after the Bataan Death March, and after they conquered those islands in the Philippines. And so in mid-October of 1944, about 160,000 American troops invade the Philippine island of Leyte. After the beach was secure, General MacArthur dramatically wades ashore from a landing craft. As news cameras recorded the historic event, MacArthur, of course, proclaimed, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." That's what he promised to do when Roosevelt evacuated him to Australia initially, and now he says, "I have returned." Well, while American troops fought their way inland, the greatest naval battle in world history develops off the coast. Okay, this is incredible. More than 280 warships were engaged in the 3-day battle of Leyte Gulf. We have a resounding victory, the Americans do, in this battle. And the Japanese, badly beaten, most of their navy is destroyed. They realize that they now have to take drastic measures if they are going to somehow even things out in this war. And this is when the Japanese employ, I'm not going to say it's a new technique for them, but kind of for the first time in World War II, they're going to employ this technique. The kamikaze technique. These are literally, right? These are suicide planes. They're meant, you stack a plane full of bombs and you tell your pilot, okay, fly this thing directly into an American ship. We need one of our planes to sink a whole American ship and all of its planes and take out all of its sailors if we're going to have a chance in this war. And that was the Japanese logic at this point after Leyte Gulf, or even during Leyte Gulf. And so the Americans can't believe this. I mean, this is crazy, right? Who would get into an airplane and just run it into an enemy ship? I mean, if you're the pilot, you know you're not going to survive. And so the Americans are pretty amazed by this Japanese technique, but this is what the Japanese feel they have to do. It doesn't work in the end. We know that. And of course, after Leyte Gulf, the Japanese military, their navy, is virtually destroyed. But their land forces are going to continue to resist. The Japanese are going to fight to the last man, basically. And, it took more than 2 months for American forces to finally control the island of Leyte. And, some 80,000 Japanese defenders on the ground were killed. Fewer than 1,000 Japanese soldiers at Leyte, Philippines, surrendered. Let's put it that way. So we hammer them out in the ocean at the Battle of Leyte Gulf with the warships. The Japanese are trying to employ the kamikaze method to even the odds, but in the end it doesn't work, although some of them do damage. And on the ground, on the island itself, it takes more than 2 months, and 80,000 Japanese die, only 1,000 of them surrender. That was kind of the mantra for a Japanese soldier. It was considered like you did not surrender. It was it was shameful to your family and and to the Japanese code of the warrior if you surrendered. And so very few Japanese will actually surrender in World War II, which, I mean, crazy stuff. Well, after we take Leyte, now it's the battle for Manila, the Philippine capital city, okay, which is on the island of Luzon in the Philippines. And this is equally hard fought, just like the Battle of Leyte was, okay. Um, it's about a month-long battle. It left most of Manila in ruins. Some over 100,000 soldiers and civilians, Philippine civilians, are killed in this. And we may not even to this day know official numbers, but those are the numbers we have. And after this month-long battle in mid-1945, Americans finally take the Philippines back for good from the Japanese. Uh, this is going to be crazy, but this is again part of the island hopping campaign, and we're getting one step closer each time to Japan. Well, the Battle of Iwo Jima, after the Philippines is secured, is one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war, all of World War II. The island's steep rocky slopes were honeycombed with caves and tunnels the Japanese had dug out. More than 600 guns, heavy guns, many encased in concrete bunkers, were naturally protected by the land there, and the Japanese knew we would invade the island, and they're just waiting for us to come. In November of 1944, American bombers begin to pound Iwo Jima from the air. For 2.5 months, American planes and warships poured nearly 7,000 tons of bombs and more than 20,000 shells onto Iwo Jima's defenders. Now, the issue, though, was that these Japanese defenders would oftentimes go down into these caves and tunnels, and while our shells are doing massive damage to the island, most of the Japanese soldiers were not affected, were not killed from them because they were in their hideouts. But um, in mid-February of 1945, then, after 2.5 months of shelling the island, Marines stormed the beach from the American ships offshore. Okay, we encounter, as American Marines, huge, furious resistance from the Japanese. After 3 days of combat, our Marines had advanced only about 700 yards inland off the beach's edge. Okay, so after 3 days, you're only going 700 yards. That tells you how fierce the Japanese were fighting and how formidable their defenses were. Eventually, though, about 110,000 American troops were involved in the campaign. Japan had about 25,000 in this battle. That gives you the idea of the numbers and the discrepancy. But despite this, it took almost a month for the Marines to secure the island and for the Americans to win the battle. The Japanese fought virtually to the last man. Okay, only you can see up here only 216 survive and are captured. Okay, for the Japanese, 216 men out of 25,000. The American casualties are around 25,000, out of 110,000 troops that we started with. So we had as many casualties during this battle as the Japanese had troops to start the battle. Okay, this is crazy. 27 medals of honor are awarded for actions on Iwo Jima, more than any other single operation of all of World War II. And one of our Navy admirals, Chester Nimitz, a top admiral, described the island as a place where, quote, uncommon valor was a common virtue. Okay, so Iwo Jima was just a brutal battle, really hard for us to take, but we got it. And just our sheer numbers are going to overwhelm them, the Japanese in the end. Of course, the famous picture from Iwo Jima, you can see on the picture on the left, there's that big kind of mountain. That's Mount Suribachi, they call it. And of course, the famous photo of the Marines lifting the flag on top of Mount Suribachi on the right. And that's kind of the lasting legacy photo of Iwo Jima. Well, after Iwo Jima now, we're one step closer, right, to Japan. And so the Battle of Okinawa, fought from April to June of 1945, was equally bloody and difficult, okay, just like Iwo Jima had been. Japan knows this is their last chance to keep the U.S. away from the Japanese mainland. Iwo Jima was brutal, but Okinawa, the Japanese are going to fight like dragons because uh, Okinawa is only about 350 miles from Japan itself. And the Japanese know if they lose Okinawa, it's over for them as far as their holdings in the Pacific, and the Americans are going to go to Japan. Okay, and so um, both American and British forces, okay, amassed off Okinawa, and it was second only in size. The invasion forces were second only in size to the Normandy invasion on D-Day, okay, in Europe. We had some 1,300 warships, 1,300 warships, and more than 180,000 combat troops, okay, to try to drive the Japanese off this island. Japanese planes, Japanese pilots flew nearly 2,000 kamikaze attacks in this battle. Okay, this is their last ditch effort. They know it. This is their last chance, right? And on the island, the Japanese defenders made equally desperate, what I'll show you in a minute, called BANZAI charges. All right, but in June, uh, when the Japanese resistance finally ends after almost 3 months of fighting, only 7,200 Japanese defenders remain to surrender. So let's look at the casualties real quick. Let's look at the numbers and the casualties. The U.S. 180,000 troops, 50,000 casualties, and I'll come back to that, okay, in just a minute. Japan, 100,000 troops to defend the island, only 7,200 surrender. Okay, I don't know how you describe this other than just incredible. Let's go back to that 50,000 American casualties. This makes Okinawa the costliest engagement for the United States in the Pacific theater. Okay, this is just crazy. Okay, so 3 months, we have more casualties at this battle than any other in the Pacific during World War II, but the Japanese fight. You know, I mean, can you imagine that? 100,000 to start with, only 7,200 surrender. So basically, you're looking at let's do the numbers: 92,800 or so Japanese troops are killed during this battle because they just won't surrender hardly, right? Unless they're just too weak to do anything else, and or the Americans get there, but before they can do some kind of an attack. Right? So let's look at real quick what the Japanese then would do, these banzai charges on the island. All right, so these are the attacks right at the end where the Japanese employed. You're a Japanese soldier. You're surrounded by an enemy. You know you have no chance. And rather than surrender, a lot of these guys would just attack and try to kill as many of the Americans and or British as they could before they die in battle, right? And so this is basically like a kamikaze attack, but just on the ground. And so this is how the Japanese try, these are their last battles in the Pacific, trying to hold their territory, and the Americans and the British, mostly Americans, forces just overwhelm them, and we take back through our island hopping campaign pretty much everything we wanted to take back, and now it's going to be onto the Japanese mainland itself, right? That's the idea, and any soldiers the Japanese have left have now returned to Japan, and their people are getting ready for us to come, and they're digging out foxholes, and they're making weapons, and they're going to have every man, woman, and child available, young and old, fight because they're convinced the Americans are going to invade the mainland. And we could have invaded with 1,000,000 people, 1,000,000 troops, and this is going to be just beyond crazy and beyond huge. And so the Japanese are thinking that's what's going to happen. Well, of course, it didn't happen that way because, unbeknownst to pretty much everybody, except for a few people within the American government and people on the Manhattan Project, of course, work was nearly done on a bomb that would make our invasion unnecessary. And of course, the bomb was used. But this is how World War II in the Pacific ends up. This is how it's going to, the fighting is going to come to a conclusion. And the only thing that's left to do is go to Japan itself. And so, like we said, of course, we know the bomb is going to be used. We'll get to that in our next presentation. Okay, but this is how it's going to play out. And it's pretty crazy. So the Japanese soldiers were ruthless. They were fierce. They, the Japanese today are known as they're hardworking, they're studious, they're very polite overall. But in World War II, they were as fierce of a fighting soldier as anybody. That includes Germany, it includes the US, it includes everybody. They were as fierce as any other soldier from any other nation. And boy, it was tough sledding for the American military in the Pacific. But in the end, we prevail.